Hello, welcome to the College for America art exhibit. I'm Sim Gallagher, and today I'll be your guide as we discuss some amazing art pieces, with an emphasis on how the human form is represented in each of them. So, the first of these pieces, we are going to be starting with Giotto's Lamentation, and we'll be moving on to it right now, so if you'll just follow me. So, here on display, we have Giotto's Lamentation. It was said to be one of the foundational pieces of the Proto-Renaissance. So what do you see when you look at this art? You immediately, of course, you can see that it's a religious piece. But if you try to ask yourself what you see ancient, Middle Age depictions of religion look like, you kind of see how the figures are don't have very much expression. They're very flat faced. They don't have necessarily very accurate bodily proportions, and they kind of they'll sometimes be floating off the ground, or they'll just kind of be representations rather than depictions that we can relate to. But when you look at this piece, which is why it was special, you can see that each individual character on or person within it has their own unique face. Not one that's like radically different from one another, but some with only subtle differences. As if they're all from the same region, or it's much more subtle, and and they all each have their own facial expression. So you see here is clearly, of course, it's the events in which Jesus is being mourned. Now, who was the artist? So, Giotto di Bondone, who was born in 1266 and lived through 1337, was an artist and architect from the Proto-Renaissance period, as we mentioned. In fact, some would say he was the artist of the Proto-Renaissance period. Many people in the Renaissance refer to as, the founding fathers, there are multiple of them, but this guy is referred to as the father of the Renaissance. During his time, he was pretty much universally loved by critics and people, and while many artists are surrounded in controversy, he was fully ingratiated with the church and did not have as much controversy that is immediately presentable to his name. His style and impact is clearly felt on as an influencer on later Renaissance pieces. You can see that he's kind of one of the more expressive takes on humanity that can be found in the Proto-Renaissance period, and people would follow that example soon after. So when was this work created? This work was created in the years 1305 to 1306. It is extremely important because it is one of the first classical Renaissance examples of multi-dimensional viewership. The subject and the matter of the artwork relate to the historical and cultural context in which it was created, because this piece was really one of the first, as we said, to use individual expression in a way that was relatable to people. It was commissioned by Enrico degli Scrovegni, who is a member of a local banking family, who, around town was known for committing acts of usury. But it is speculated that Enrico was fearful of hell and aware of his sins, and was trying to buy his way back into heaven through good works, which was a common and sanctioned practice amongst the Catholic Church at the time, and would actually be one of the things that incited the entire Protestant Revolution. Now we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty of just describing the subject of the piece. As we said, this is the moment that Christ is being mourned by not just earth, but also heaven. Everything in this piece comes and it focuses on Christ, which is, everything is angled down towards Christ. The colors are passive in the background. They're a beautiful blue. There's tones of red and greens in the robes. Really sophisticated uses of paint. It looks like they're wearing actual robes that are sitting on them. Each face is turned down in various expressions. Even the angels themselves all have unique faces of expression, of woe, of disbelief, of pain. Holding Jesus is his mother, Mary, here. She holds him up off the ground and is the closest to him. and Mary Magdalene is holding his feet, and these are the disciples marked with the halos around their heads. The composition of this painting introduces this assemblage for one of the first times that is recorded, a sort of three-dimensionality where there's the background, people sitting in our space, the foreground, and people disappearing into the back. It really gives you a feeling of this crowd extending backwards, that there's a presence of mourners that exists far beyond just who's present here, but they are kept at bay, while the focused and more recognizable saints who are recognizable in the church are out on display. There's a lone tree in the background that really kind of fills this negative space. Otherwise, it would just kind of slope up, and you could say that this tree is now bare of life without Christ. There's some symbolism involved. It is bare, I think, because it would probably distract a little bit more from the center of the piece to have something there besides the tree, or to have a tree that was filled and lifeful. Would be kind of strange. People would question what was the meaning of the tree, and it would distract, but instead it's painted mostly the same color as the rock, so it's clearly a part of the background, and everything slopes down into Jesus. Now, these elements all draw the viewer in as a participant, as like a mourner, as if they are standing amongst the mourners themselves. Now, the use of perspective is very important here for where it draws the eye. When you ask yourself where your eye is drawn, it's of course drawn to Jesus, who is actually, if you look, is all in the vanishing point. Everything here points to Jesus. Everyone is looking at Jesus. The landscape uses three-dimensionality in order to really draw the eye towards him. The landscape is reduced to a linear mountain range, and with very little distraction involved. There's an asymmetrical placement of the angels and the people. The way they stand around Jesus is much more it has a sense of realism, where it's as if a crowd of people are actually gathering. It's not one by one stuck up representation. It is as if you are there, as we said. The expression of the angels above everyone's head is just enough angels to not seem crowded. And the sculptured posturing of the mourners, each mourner has a unique reaction ascribed to their to what would be recognizable figures in the biblical pantheon, and it takes these figures that are normally held in reliefs and in massive expressions, and uses a very natural, realistic depiction of grief. Now, this was a dramatic departure, as we've said, as from the traditional one-dimensional imagery of Byzantine art. And Giotto really pioneered this new sense of placement and drawing the eye. It's a sort of figurative realism, and it really resonated with persons in the early 1300s who had begun to view their world, their past, and their relationship with God in a more three-dimensional way. Relating themselves to stories and asking questions, and it was the future in a way, and this is why he's called the father of the Renaissance for what he did here. Now, if we describe how the bodies are depicted and the representation of the human form is depicted, it's really more realistic and unique to each person. Each person has a different body type. While it's not as immediately apparent, it's not like an animated difference in body type, but there are realistic looking figures that you can see yourself as. Now, and you can see each individual face of the mourner is a unique one. Don't be fooled. If you really look, these faces are unique. They may be similar, but they are unique. And even the angels have unique faces and facial structures and hair, and it's really, really special. Now, how do I think the representation of bodies contribute to the message that they're trying to convey? I think that his goal was to create a more relatable and as if you were there image of what was happening. And he really, really does that by creating varied and realistic posturing and positioning around Jesus, and at the same time maintains this art piece that doesn't distract. It isn't too crowded. It's just the perfect amount of showing how many people are dedicated to his passing. People. We all know humanity mourned, and so of course they're relegated to the background in a mass that's hard to tell how many people there are, but it just implies that there is a crowd of people just from that alone. And then in the rest are the apostles, and it really conveys a less holy representation necessarily, and a relatable representation as well as a holy representation, because of the I called them halos before, but they're auroras. What he was trying to do from all of this was, as I said, was create a relatable and humanistic depiction of the death of Christ. He does this with his unique faces and personages and postures, and there was no doubt that this was also commissioned by the church, so they probably asked for this scene in particular, or maybe they gave him creative license. But it is clear that he was asked to depict this scene, and instead of giving them something that they've seen before, he really used his talent to bring to life this scene. That's what he does. He doesn't just show you how it happened, he really brings it to life and shows you what it would have been like to have been there. And the subject matter and style contributes to this message because it grants you that sense of realism and that sense of being there, while at the same time maintaining a holy reverence. Now, moving on from Giotto's Lamentation, we're going to talk about the only sculpture in our exhibit, which is Donatello's David. Not to be confused with Michelangelo's David, which is, the famous tall, or massive actually, marble bust of David as a man. But this is instead a bronze done by Donatello, because he created two, but we'll be focusing on this one, that depicts David in his moment of triumph over Goliath in the story when he was a boy. Now, who was the artist? We're going to talk about Donatello. His real name, as pronounced in Italian, is Donato di Niccolo di Bettobardi, and he was born in Florence, Italy, which was a town pretty much raised up by the Medici family, which is a noble family who were the ones to actually commission this piece, where it sat in their gardens for a very long time. It's important to note that when this piece was commissioned, it wasn't necessarily commissioned for the public. It was, in fact, commissioned for the gardens. And when was this work created? It was between 1430 and 1440, which was a time, a very religious time indeed. Especially, how Italy was. So there's a lot of conflicting philosophies arising in the time. Donatello, he used the classic Greek technique of lost wax casting, where he would pour molten metals like bronze, copper, and tin into a mold and create this. And so the subject matter of the style and the style of the artwork relate to the historical and cultural context in which it was created. Now, knowing that it was a private piece is important, because it really does something that not a lot of pieces had done or were doing it at the time, which was, it celebrated the body. The body was instead of the spirit. Now, this is not something that was super popular at the time due to religious reasons, that the body was thought to be impure. And when you really look at David here, it's like... it's very, there's kind of a sensuousness to this pose. So we'll be talking more about that later when we discuss the subject. But for now, we're going to talk about how this piece and its subject matter and style really relate to the historical and cultural context in which it was created. Now, when you look at this pose, what you see is just a victory of something small and pure over something large and powerful. Has reference in the recognizable story of David and his triumph over Goliath. Now, the historical context is, at the time, Florence, the city where this was commissioned, was in conflict with a larger and more powerful city-state of Milan. So in many ways, the Medici family may have identified, and the people of Florence may have identified with David and their triumph over and his fight against a larger and more powerful opponent in Goliath in the way that they were fighting this larger city-state of Milan. Now, David was also the first freestanding male nude in over 1,000 years that was known to depict the human body, especially the male body, in such a sensual manner, and in a way that wasn't seen since the Greek and Roman times. So you can see that David's pose is one of relaxed contrapposto, which is when the feet are turned one way and the body is turned in a way that causes flexion of the torso and really obeys the entirety of the muscles. So it's inherently a kind of alluring, satisfied, and victorious state that shows off the body. It's very classic Greek and Roman pose. Now, there's the subject. Now, when we really look at the subject, what you see is this victory of the small over the strong. Really, truly emphasized with the amount of emphasis on the diminutiveness, the kind of androgynous youth of David and his smallness in relation to looking at Goliath and his helmet. David doesn't even truly wear a real war helmet. Goliath is wearing a full-born war helmet. He's a bearded man, and yet he is defeated beneath David, who is so much smaller and less powerful. And you can tell just by the head of Goliath that he is, this guy was bigger than this guy. And the fact that this little guy is standing over this guy's head is holding his sword, it really invites the question. And they really, and Donatello was really able to create that effect, that dichotomy between Goliath and David, and that was one of his main goals, I believe, in what is academically debated often with for the reasons for why he is so sensuous and so almost effeminate at times. Looking at his face and the curve of his face, his long hair. I think it's really to draw out the dichotomy between him and Goliath. Now here, the subject, for those who are not familiar, is David, it's a biblical story in which a young boy who is part of a subjugated tribe by, I believe, an invading army, challenges the greatest warrior of this invaded army, who has never been defeated, to a duel. And while this giant is fully armored and has killed many men, and their bodies lay in the sand, David approaches with nothing but a sling, and with one, knowing that he is charged with this task by God, and going in unarmored, he slays Goliath in one fell shot with his sling. And this really is, part of what relates to Milan and Florence. They perhaps fancied themselves, David, in their fight. And David holds Goliath's sword here in his hand, and it's a really gruesome depiction of Goliath's head, but it's balanced out completely by the kind of the sensuous and delicate femininity of David. Now, the representation of bodies contribute to what the message tries to convey. It's the entire message is this triumph of purity and innocence over death, over strength, and over heresy, essentially. Philistine infidelity, which is embodied in Goliath and his murderousness. He was known to be very murderous, and yet this boy David triumphs, and he becomes his king, not Goliath's king, but becomes the king of his people. And that is really just brought out here in the human form more than anywhere else, I'd say, than are more than in any of the other pieces, I'd say, is how relevant the human form is in direct relation to the message I believe Donatello is trying to convey. Now, moving on to our next piece, we'll be talking about The Elevation of the Cross by Sir Peter Paul Rubens. Now, who was the artist? Peter Paul Rubens was a Flemish artist, and he was considered essentially the most influential artist of the Flemish Baroque tradition, which, if you don't know what Flemish means, it's a kind of, it's a peoples that lives in the area around Belgium and Netherlands and France. And so he was kind of a mix of Dutch and French, and to just say it simply. Now, the work was created in 1610 to 1611. The subject matter of the artwork is the reverse of the Lamentation, in that it is the elevation of Jesus on the cross as opposed to him being off of the cross. Now, historically, this piece was created in destruction of many art pieces during the Protestant Revolution. You see that because Protestants reviled creation of imagery of holy events, and so they would go through churches destroying, they would go through Catholic churches destroying what they saw as blasphemy or as distractions of what should be something holy and idealized and kind of unpictured. So this art piece was commissioned by the church and created by Rubens almost in response to that. And what you see here is it is really a call to worship, a call to feel Jesus's pain, in my opinion. Now, to describe the subject, it's the subject of Christ on the cross being raised. It's both powerful and moving, and it's grotesque at the same time. It's really, it takes so much when you're looking at it. You see, now the subject of Christ on the cross here can be seen. He's here. The good and the people who are lamenting are here. They're horrified. How dramatic it all is. You have a man on a horse, commanding the others to raise. And this is not a beautiful horse. This is not a beautiful man. This is one of the sinners. He holds the stake. It's angled down. All of these men are kind of one being, bent towards the task of raising Jesus up on the cross. While Jesus' body is beautiful, it is much more divine. It is there. He's paler than everyone else. He has the light shining on him. Everyone else, in comparison, is they're twisted. They're almost brute and animalistic, raising him up, all bent towards one form. Their humanity isn't really given shape. No other faces save partial turn face here and partial turn face here, obscured by a beard. It distracts, really, because the human eye is drawn to faces. What is central is Jesus' face looking upturned. Everyone's eyes, even just the coloration, it draws up here. Now, this is a sense of realism, with the difficulty and strain required by the mass of laborers to bring the cross to bear. Christ's anatomically exact expression, yet is balanced by the inhumanity and inexactness of the sinners. There's a contrast drawn between the two parties of Jesus and the sinners and the innocent, with lighter tones for them and more human, more recognizable postures versus the twisted, brutalized forms of the sinners raising Jesus up. Even as Christ is raised up onto the cross and is at his most vulnerable, there is a kind of a power to him. There is a beautiful twisting of his body, and his body is admirable in a way that even as he is dying, he is and looking up to his Father in heaven. It's very dramatic. It's moving. You feel for him, and this is a powerful depiction that reflects the influence of high Renaissance in painters. This is well past the Renaissance period at this point, but you really see an influence on the human form and creating a divine beauty out of the body here in Jesus. Now, all of this whole dramatic piece It's really dramatized by boom the diagonal slanting lines of the cross, cutting across the center of a piece, and it's got it's literally bringing Jesus up into the fore. It would invoke emotion, when you looked at this. When you walked into a church as a worshiper in 1610 and you saw this up above, you would feel for Christ. You would hate those who are doing this to him, and it was just meant to do that. It was really meant to invoke your sense of wonder for what Jesus did for you, this pain that he went through. For context, this was a 15 by 20 foot painting, and it was raised high above the worshippers on an altar within the cathedral. So it was huge. It was the size of a movie theater screen. And this piece was commissioned by the Catholic Church in the wake of the Protestant rebellions in order to do just that, to really show their worship in a way that was rejected by the Protestants. Bodies contribute to this message so fully here, because the people who are not okay with what is going on, they're depicted as human, while the people who are making it happen are bent, twisted animals who are just all one conglomerate mass. It really, really makes it stand out. So, based on the information that we have, it's really clear that that Rubens was trying to make you feel Christ's pain, was trying to depict this moment in a theatrical way. It really feels, everything is proposed in a way that everything has meaning. While it is ostensibly you walking into a moment and seeing it as if you are there, it at the same time is dramatized. Everybody is in the perfect pose to, depict meaning or to convey a meaning. You have I think these might be apostles or more educated folk over here who are off to the side holding hands through the pain as they watch. You have the laborers who are bringing Christ in. Some of them are literally, they you see the anger in their expressions as they feel like they're doing some great justice. And then you have the dramatic inclusion of the woman breastfeeding. Don't know why she would you'd ever bring your breastfeeding child to a crucifixion, but that's how it was. So it's just the real theatricality of it all that really strikes at everything that's happening. Now, the subject matter and the style really contribute because there's just such a raw strength to what you see, while in the midst of this rage and this fervor that's bringing, Jesus maintains his divinity. He says, "Father, forgive them; they know not what they do." You can really see that imparted. You don't see a man here who is willing to curse those who are necessarily below him. At least not in this moment. And the composition drawing all your eyes towards Christ with the brightest point in the middle is really what completes that, because it is about Christ in the end, and invoking that emotion and making you feel his pain, and he really did that. Now moving on to Oath of the Horatii by Jacques-Louis David, who is a French painter, philosopher, and eventual revolutionary. And this painting, in fact, has a lot of revolutionary undertones. Here we see the painting in full. Jacques-Louis David was part of the French Revolution, believe it or not. He actually eventually voted for the beheading of the king. And as he did that, he also painted this on commission for the king of about half a decade before the revolution began. This work was created in 1784 through 1785, and the French Revolution was in 1789. So it's very, very, it's things are definitely brewing. People are already upset and have been upset for a long time. The American Revolution has already happened. Now, noted as this is also noted as one of the founding pieces of neoclassicism, classicism or neoclassicism. It uses geometric lines and framing and posturing and tonal contrasts and light to great effectiveness. So now let's talk about the subject matter here. We can see, what do you immediately see? You see a bunch of men swearing before a sword, and you see also immediately that there are women who are dismayed. Now, there is a story behind this. Now, the Oath of Horatii is an oil on canvas. It's painted by David and is currently located in the Louvre Museum in France. Now, it was done in direct rebellion against the prevailing style of the day, which was Rococo, which up to that point has been favored by kings and the aristocracy. It was opulent and gilded in gold, but it eventually became drawn out and tired. There had been scenes of lush gardens, pictures of noble lifestyles that didn't necessarily deliver messages beyond the scenes themselves. And at the time, philosophers like Voltaire were calling for art that depicted virtue and morality. Now, this scene taps into that. It answers that call. It was first displayed in 1785, towards the end of what was known as the Enlightenment period. And it was almost immediately a favorite of both the critics and the republics. In fact, they had to extend the salon viewership. They had to extend it several days past when it was originally supposed to close because people kept coming to see the painting. Now, it depicts a classic scene about a story where Rome was at Rome with Alba, a neighboring country. And instead of sending armies, each city sends 3 brothers. Now, they're forced to battle to the death. Now, the context of patriotism and loyalty to a country over personal self, it would really relate to the French people at this time, who know that they're going to have to rise up for their country. People are already calling for a revolution, and this painting will become really kind of a symbol of that for them. It really rise to popularity because of that. So the use of space, you can see. So the use of space is de-emphasized really by the Horatii, and it really puts a focus, all on the focus point of it, which you can see the focus point here is all drawn to the swords. The light hits the swords, but at the same time, empowered in the front is the oath itself. Now, the background doesn't distract. In fact, it uses the shadows of the archways, which are both Roman and call to the story itself and identify the story itself, but also really it also really creates a nice, clear, dark contrast between the swords, the clothes they're wearing, and it brings them out. It makes them pop, and you don't really see the background as much, but it's also very pleasant to look at. So it's the composition really draws to the unfolding moment of importance, and then also after invites you to see the effects of what is going on, and it tells the story. So the stone pavement is geometrical and creating orthogonal and intersecting lines, and they all end at this vanishing point right here. When you look at the figures and the postures and the human representation here, the women are represented as docile, and they are flowing, and they don't have anything to say. They are resigned to what is happening here. The men are the opposite. They are strong, they are bold, they are dedicated, they are really ready. You look at the women versus looking at the men here. Boom, boom. You can really see how united the brothers are. They're literally grasping each other, and that's just really an attitude that of brotherhood and duty that is really, really telling of the time, especially that Jax would become a revolutionary himself. And basically nobody will win in this fight because no matter what, the family members are going to die. So while it is an ultimate victory for the people of both cities, it's an ultimate victory for them because nobody's going to war. But no matter what, this family is going to be decimated by the combat. So it's depicting that, and it's depicting the duty and the obligation that these men will loyally uphold. When you look at this man, you don't see a man proud to be delivering the oath to his sons. You see him dedicated to the duty, strong like them, but you don't see someone who is really, really uh, ready and feeling. He's not really feeling it, to say. Now, to historically contextualize, in 1785, when this painting was first displayed, there was just a shift in thinking amongst the French people. They encouraged the philosophers were encouraging people to openly criticize the divine rights of kings, and democracy was really brewing, and the French Revolution was really on the way. So this painting, once more, really called to those beliefs, and I honestly believe that that is what the ultimate goal of the painter was. He really was tapping into something that he felt strongly about, and he eventually would be a revolutionary. So it makes sense that he painted this. So moving on from Oath of the Horatii, we'll be going to our next painting, which is realist, but much less theatrical, much more. It's not depicting a historical scene, but it's in fact painting a scene that can very easily become from reality, and it's a very loaded image for a lot of reasons, with a lot of different potentials behind it. This is Olympia, created by Edouard Monet in 1856. It is an oil on canvas painted by him, and it is located in the Orsay Museum in Paris, France. And the style is absolute realism, as you can see. That while there's a stylisticism to it, especially with the cat. Back then, you have to remember, unless you had a cat in front of you or a book with a picture of a cat in it, a photorealistic image of a cat in it, it's kind of hard to paint a cat. So he probably just drew this cat from memory. Now, this painting is really, really an interesting one. It was first exhibited in the Salon in Paris in 1856, and critics and public were so outraged by it that they had to hang it up high above people's heads to prevent people from destroying it. Manet intentionally was challenging a lot of different things when he created this. Manet was very intentionally challenging the public when he created this nude. He broke from tradition, the traditional nude. He broke from traditions of decency and subject for about what a female nude should look like. There was no more stylized and classical nude that you would find in the Renaissance. The formula was gone. Here you found a woman in her imperfections, you would say. Her features are not stylized. Her face is, it's a regular face. It's her lips are somewhat thinner than they should be necessarily, and than they should be. That's offensive, but then traditional standards of beauty. Her body is very pale. There's no modeling, no shadowing. Around here. The composition of the piece draws you to really just look directly at her. When you really, she's staring at you. It's almost as if you are walking in on her. There's a black cat, and there is a servant, a traditional servant, which is a brusque assumption made, but it's from her clothes and also from the socioeconomic divides. Well, not even socioeconomic. It was 1856. Slavery still was around. While not prevalent in France, it was still something that kind of pervaded. There was definitely a sense of racism still, and a racial divide in class structure. And she is bringing flowers. Some critics, or not critics, some people speculate that it's from a client. And there's this black cat. There's a lot of traditional symbolism behind a black cat, which I find very interesting that he chose to paint a black cat here. I think someone might say he chose to paint a cat because he just didn't want to distract from her, and he wanted her to be the focus. Now her stare is almost challenging. It's almost like she is disappointed in you. It's pretty much like an in-your-face kind of painting, and it was very much designed that way. He was kind of dismantling the entire idea that we looked at nude paintings to derive enlightenment, and that there was a purity to looking at nudes. He forces the viewer to acknowledge that their interest is sexual when confronting them with this nude. And he does it. He doesn't idealize anything. He just makes like just a regular nude woman. This and with there you can tell that there's how the sense of realism is there. The skin pushes up between her fingers. The bed is disrupted. She's not covered by anything except herself. There's no cherubs coming down and anointing her or revealing her. She's just exposed, and she's staring at you for it. Now, Monet is often referred to as the father of Impressionism. His piece, now that was once shunned, is now considered a priceless 19th century painting. Now, the body is depicted in a way that is real and is without pomp, is without, and it just broke with convention. And that was very, very risque at the time. Now, based on all the information that is available to us, what I think the artist was trying to do or say to this work is definitely be controversial. I think that he wanted to disrupt. I think he knew what would upset people, and he did it anyway. And that's what this little black cat is. It's just a little ring of bad luck, or a little bit of a little dash on there. And there's kind of a sense of dynamicism here, that there's kind of something loaded about, if you think about the context of racial injustice and the context of slavery, it's about the fully clothed black woman just staring at this white woman who, and the name Olympia was associated with prostitution. It is important to know. So there's almost like there's a sense of exposure, literally, white guilt maybe being exposed. I don't know. And coupled with the black cat and it's in a disrupted room. Behind it all, it really combines for just a sense of there's something going on here, and it's problematic. And I really enjoy the painting for this reason. I think that the message and the goal to be controversial, his style really contributes to this. It's the realism within it. When he renders the human form realistically, it doesn't allow them to feel like they're contriving, or that like they're doesn't allow them to justify anything. They're just walking in on this Olympia and her, and he's like exposing them in a way to her, and they are indecent for looking at. And it's to say his subject matter would contribute to this message. I think that the subject matter and style are what make the message powerful in the first place. If the style wasn't so full of realism and so full of life, then it wouldn't really land or hit the sensitive viewer nearly as powerfully. So it's probably what did the striking in the first place, I would say. Now, moving on from Monet's Olympia and to our last painting in the exhibit, to Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. I've butchered that pronunciation, but the artist is much easier to pronounce and much more recognizable. Probably the most recognizable name in the artist world is Picasso. This is one of his earlier pieces. Now, it was created in 1907 while he was a young man, while he was in Paris, staying there and studying the arts. Now, when you look at this, all of the other paintings right away, there's a much easier sense of composition. There's a much easier sense of where the eye is supposed to go. But when this hits you, while it has clearly a trained artist's sensibilities of placement, the perspective is inconsistent, and it really just hits you as one entire whole rather than a journey. With the ratio, it's going, you're traveling through. Talk about how boom, this hits you, and you're invited to see her body and be exposed. Ratio, boom, you see the swords and everything that leads to here. Christ is centerpiece here, but this is just everything all at once and that's really one of the essences of Picasso, is that he takes different fundamentals, cracks them apart, mixes them together, and does something that is entirely him. He was developing this style. Now, in 1907, this is before World War One. This is when he was a young man in Paris. Um, when the style and the subject matter relates to the historical context, I will tell you the story of this painting. So Picasso came to this Paris, came to Paris, which, as we know, is a cultural hub for art and a place that at the time was popularly dominated by some institutional senses of art in the more public circles. In particular, neoclassical, which while was new and fresh here, was less new and fresh. It had been around since 1784 by this point. So it had become, while it was the fresh breakout as described before here, nowadays Picasso is craving something more. And so he comes to Paris and he starts cracking apart different available art genres and creating something entirely new, entirely Picasso is what he would say. And in a way, and he does it in a way that stuns and angers a lot of people, but it eventually made him Picasso, made him famous. And so Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. I looked up the pronunciation, but it still challenges me sometimes. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or The Young Ladies of Avignon, is an oil on canvas. And it was done in 1907, and it's currently located in the Museum of Art in New York City. It's proto-cubist, which is Picasso's own style, and it's a radically new way of representing reality. So he completely rejected the traditional three-dimensional style of portraying things, of painting, and instead he emphasizes the two-dimensional nature to his art. He takes polygons and ascribes life to them that's recognizable with a few key lines. You see the women here, but if you took away a few lines, they'd just be shapes. But that's the power of Picasso. Now, he takes linear perspective and foreshortening and models, and he disassembles the people and the objects laid out into their basic shapes, into what makes them them. You recognize these shapes as fruit, but only because of the tones that he has applied. You recognize these as women only because you can see from this tone here that you can kind of a sense of the curve of her body just from this diamond shape. It's really kind of incredible. Now, but what he does is he disassembles and layers things in these opaque and transparent planes, and shows things from different viewpoints all at the same time, which is why, as I said before, it denies that traditional sense of viewing. Now, getting into the history of this more the title of this painting is The Young Ladies of Avignon, translated, and Avignon is a street was a street in Barcelona associated with prostitution. So these women are prostitutes, and she's pushing her way through a curtain, and they're all on display, but you see that two of them are marked, they're stained. And what that was, speculate that the painting was about STDs, that these two people are infected with syphilis. And at the time, Picasso would have had access to the colonialist acquisitions of the Parisians and the French in Africa, because they were doing colonialist activities in Africa, and they were bringing back African masks, and it was known that he was studying African art and African masks at the time, and he really took that and he imparted that here. You still see a face, but there's a wrongness, there's an otherness from these three women here, and then women are almost transformed into monsters. So he uses a collection of different styles and art pieces, and really, he takes archaic figures, ancient Spanish, and art and Iberian art with these women in the faces here, and he combines all of it with chiaroscuro, modulation of light and shadow, and there's still a sense of traditional structure and foreground and background, and it's kind of there but kind of not, and it's dreamlike, and it was considered extremely confrontational because at the time, because it kind of took 500 years of European painting tradition and set and cracked it open. And this was at a time where he had been in Paris, so people would have had a lot of pre-established notions about art. Um, the tension in this painting, there is a tension, and a lot of it ascribed to Picasso's known fear of STDs, because at the time syphilis would have been a death sentence for him if he had caught it. So these people these women are infected. They're tainted. It travels down them. That they're almost like traps, monsters hidden amongst. If you just make the wrong choice here, you could die, kind of thing. Now, the style is different from anything else at the time, and the bodies here are really represented from these different perspectives in a way that denies and takes fragmentary pieces and slams together all these different aspects of traditional art. While it's the human body is broken down into shapes and not at all depicted, but instead represented, and it's expressed. And without a few choice lines here and there, and without the faces, they would simply be vaguely humanoid polygons. But he assigns tone. You can see the small of her back and feel that inflection and the curve of her rear. Just once he assigns skin tone to them, these polygons become almost sensual. Nude women, you can see the curve of her. She's simultaneously being viewed from the front, the direct front, and she's turning and showing her body off to you. They raise their arms like this in a pose that models and maybe even prostitutes did when they were trying to display themselves to you. So how do the representations of bodies contribute to the message that tries to convey? It's kind of a dreamlike, unsteady haze, and if you make the wrong choice stepping into this room, you could die. There's a wrongness to the women, and there's a thing that Picasso himself would probably deny a direct message or a direct meaning, and he would be cryptic with his art, as was his nature, and he would play with the subjective nature of his art. But I think that there is definitely a fear here. There was a fear that informed this painting, and based on I think Picasso was trying to abstractly represent this fear of syphilis, and he did it quite brilliantly. While it is kind of dehumanizing and offensive to physically mutate the women who are infected into basically what are monsters, we can contextualize that this time. At the time there isn't really any sense of political correctness or sensitivity, and also he could just hide behind the subjectivity of art if you call him out on that. Now, the abstract and almost subjective nature of the piece are what really allow it. The subject matter and the style, they entirely contribute to the message, because the message is unclear. The viewer is able, unlike all the others, is more readily able to derive their own meaning from this. And it's the abstract and almost subjective nature of the piece that allow us to almost more universally derive something from it. There is a sense of completion and a sense of beauty and accomplishment when you look at it, even though it's almost more comparable to a child's drawing, in that it's broken down. It's because he reached mastery of these fundamental principles, and then he is breaking them down, as opposed to being a complete child who is only able to imitate crudely. It is the opposite, in fact. So with Picasso, it is a very much either a love or hate relationship. Some people are really spoken to by this ability, or some people just kind of see the fragments and just see a bunch of fragments. They don't see the whole that the fragments create, or it just doesn't reach them. And it turns something that's very personal and impulsive and makes it universal and also subjective and powerful. And that's how the style really contributes to the message that Picasso was conveying. There is this message of fear and uncertainty when you step into this room is really kind of there and persists despite the subjectivity of it. The question of these women is proposed always, no matter what. Like, why are they this? Well, they are this. And that is truly what is so powerful about the painting. So now that we've finished looking at all of our pieces, we're going to be moving on to the compare and contrast portion of this exhibit. And the two artists will be comparing and contrasting are Giotto and Monet. So I took the two pieces that I thought both symbolically and contextually and visually are the strongest opposites of each other, because those were the most potent comparing and contrasting pieces for me. So here on the left we have Monet, and then we have its predecessor, its distant predecessor with Giotto's Lamentation. These two pieces, I'd say, are amongst the most opposite by far. One is a sacred scene, and the other is a direct attack on convention. One is foundational, the beginning of a renaissance. It's something that many things drew from, and the other is literally announcing a shift, a departure away from the old and the new tenets of classicism and decency. And one work was cherished and praised, and the other was, at least at first, was reviled and hated by the public. We've talked about how the spirit of these two pieces are completely different. There are quite a few artistic differences as well, which would make sense, seeing as one is a primordial example of the tenets that guide the creation of this one. If not for this, this would never be, kind of thing. Let's talk about that some more. Directly first, we can compare and contrast the tones and the colors, and the subject matter. This is a nude. There's only two people in the photo and the cat, and here there's a crowd of people. It's a public event, and here's the intimate event between the viewer and Olympia. Now, let's compare the stylistic differences. One is a fresco and was painted, and the other was also painted, but it was realism. You can see from here, the skin pushed up between the fingers versus the dispersal of angels and how the background is used to draw attention to the main subject. Here, the main subject is on display, very clear. Your eyes are drawn to it immediately. It's a streak of white color in amidst dark. While here, the subject is required to be revealed by the vanishing point and the view lines of everything in this white streak, drawing your eye down to Jesus. Boom. Here, very different means of drawing the eye to the subject. Here is a slash of white. Olympia, if you really kind of just stare at Olympia or take your glasses off, Olympia really is this entire cliff, would be one of the main differences. Now, the similarities, I would say, if not for this would not be. While the techniques for painting faces this advanced and real weren't really popularized. Maybe there was some lone genius that we don't really know about, or for some reason it isn't popular, but otherwise, those faces weren't really able to be rendered the way they are here and here. The techniques didn't exist. So, but the similarities I would draw would be the fact that there are facial expressions that impart anything at all. This man, he's more contemplative. This man is speaking to this man. This woman is trying to hold off her woe. This woman is bending over. This woman this man seems to be in the midst of some kind of fervor. The expressions, I would say, are similar. And the draping of clothing exists in both as well. The draping of robes exists. Cloth hanging down is a huge theme here, as well as it is a huge theme here. There is an element of servitude or an element of secondarism. These people are all handling Jesus. But otherwise, to compare and contrast, they're very tonally different, and spiritually they are almost opposites. And that is why I chose to compare and contrast these two paintings. But otherwise, that will be it for the compare and contrast and for the exhibit. Thank you so much for enjoying the exhibit, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And now, otherwise, thank you very much for watching the video. that will be it for today.